highly anticipated speaker for this evening is Minister Priyanca Radhakrishnan. She is the Minister for the Community and Voluntary Sector, Minister for Diversity, Inclusion and Ethnic Communities, Minister for Youth, Associate Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, and Associate Minister for Social Development and Employment, as well as being the MP for Mangakiki. She is the first person of Indian origin to become a minister in New Zealand and was appointed in November 2020. She was born in India but went to school in Singapore and then moved to New Zealand to further her education. She has spent her life's work advocating on behalf of people whose voices are often unheard. This includes survivors of domestic violence and migrant workers who have been exploited. She strongly believes that everyone has the right to live with dignity, and that means equitable access to affordable housing, quality education, and decent, secure work. Throughout the event, we encourage everyone to take part in the korero by submitting questions for Priyanca via Slido. To participate in the Q&A, or to see what other people are asking, please visit slido.com, and the event code for today is 36912. The instructions on how to use Slido, as well as the event code, will be provided in the chat box for those online. Feel free to reach out to our team if you're having any technical difficulties. So without further ado, let's get started. Kia ora, Priyanca, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening with us. We're very grateful to have you here.
Kia ora.
So my first question for the evening is, please tell us about your stories. That's who you are, your whakapapa, and your journey to where you are right now.
Thanks, Shaheen. And can I just first say kia ora koutou. It's great to be here with you all. I've been looking forward to this, really. So thank you for the invitation. Can I just acknowledge, as Benita did, Michelle and the team from Multiethnic Young Leaders. You do an amazing job. So, and I don't think you just inspire the next generation, I think you inspire all us oldies too. So thank you for your work. Can I also acknowledge KPMG for the support that you've clearly provided the group and for hosting us here today, and your very warm welcome, Benita. So thank you, and congrats on the award. I was at Diversity Works Awards night as well, so great to see the work that you're doing in the wider inclusivity space as well. So I think you touched on my story, or the start of my story,
yes,
really. Oh, no, don't be, it's all good. So I was born in India. My first migration experience was at the tender age of 3 months, so I don't really remember any of it, but I'm told that I cried the whole way on the 3.5-hour flight from Chennai, where I was born, to Singapore, where I grew up. So grew up in Singapore, went to school, worked for a short while with a women's rights NGO called AWARE, the Association of Women for Action and Research. And then I was kind of at a point in my life where I wanted to step outside my comfort zone. You know, my parents were migrants to Singapore. It was the quintessential migrant story where they worked hard. It provided for my sister and I, and we never wanted we were comfortable. We never wanted for anything. Singapore's a pretty easy place to grow up. Great public transport, safe, and all of that. Huge positives. But I wanted to step out of my comfort zone and go somewhere where I didn't know anybody. And so that was a prerequisite. I wasn't brave enough to go somewhere that didn't speak English. So New Zealand ticked a lot of boxes for me. I didn't know a soul here at the time. It was as different, I think, to Singapore as I could imagine, in terms of wide open spaces and interestingly enough, work-life balance, something that I don't get a lot of now, but New Zealand is known for that. And the fact that women won the right to vote first in the Western world here was a draw card for me. And like many others, I watched Lord of the Rings, so, So anyway, I decided to move here and I came here as an international student to finish my undergrad degree. So came from about 32 degrees Singapore to Palmerston North in the middle of winter, which was great. I loved it. I had a great, student experience here. Loved university. Ran my first campaign at Massey University to be the international students rep on Musa. So shout out to student unions. And then started working with a refuge organisation straight out of uni. that works with women of Asian, African, Middle Eastern origin here in New Zealand, called Shakti. I worked with them for about 6 to 7 years, and I was, interestingly enough, had my first ever job interview in Onehunga, in the electorate that I now represent, and where I live, so a slight full circle moment. Even more full circle moment, and I haven't really talked about this much, but my first experience of a home when I was about 2 years old was on a street called One Tree Hill in Singapore. So, yeah.
It was just fate that you ended up in New Zealand.
Yeah, I know, and Maunga Keke, which of course is One Tree Hill. So I was hired actually to revive Shakti Centre in Tauranga, and worked there for some time. So part of my role was crisis casework, part of it was lobbying governments, successive governments for change, legislative and policy change, based on the experiences of women who needed support. So I guess that was my introduction to New Zealand's political sphere or political world. So it was select committee submissions, things like that I did. And at that time, I also joined the Labour Party. My boss at the time was running for Labour. That's how I got involved, accidentally, really, but stayed on because the values of a social democratic party represented or reflected my own. At the time, Helen Clark was Prime Minister, and they were the only government that had done anything tangible for migrant communities as well. So never once crossed my mind to stand for Parliament, but just got involved like a lot of other people do and worked behind the scenes at, through successive elections and so on. Worked for a while with the Ministry for Women in a policy analysis role on the wider issue of family violence and primary prevention. So how do you change the landscape so that violence doesn't occur? That's some of the work that I was doing at the ministry. And then I did, to cut a long story short, it's already very long, I know, but to cut a long story short, I did my master's at Vic in development studies, and happened to meet, through the course of one of those papers, a former senior cabinet minister who said to me that you'd worked for so many years in the NGO space, knocking on the doors for change. Why don't you try and be at the table? And that appealed. And that's when I thought, well, hadn't really ever considered standing for Parliament. You don't, as a migrant. But then I thought I'd give it a shot. Yeah, so there you go. That's my entire life story.
Very interesting, and thank you for that exclusive. That kind of leads into my next question. Was this kind of the career or leadership pathway that you wanted when you were younger, when you were growing up? Did you ever expect to be
God, no.
cabinet minister in Parliament?
No, not for a minute, frankly. So when I was growing up, I wanted to be many different things. I wanted to be a pilot because at the time Singapore Airlines didn't allow women to be pilots, and so I really wanted to do it. Unfortunately, I had really bad eyesight growing up. I was like, at 20, I was practically blind. So I had LASIK eye surgery, and that's, was a defining moment in my life, but also made me realize that there was no way I could be a pilot. I wanted to be a lawyer, I wanted to be a journalist. Honestly, I had no path. It was not something that I charted for myself, frankly. So I think the social work aspect of things and policy analysis, a lot of my life kind of just happened, in a sense. And like I said, it was only when it was suggested to me that I run for Parliament, and the person who suggested it offered to be a mentor. That was when I thought that this was perhaps something I could think of doing. Yeah. So I often call myself an accidental politician.
No, I love that. So how does that tie into your definition of leadership? And since you've gone through this journey, how has your definition of leadership changed as a result of the experiences?
Yeah, so I think leadership really boils down to the ability to influence change, right? And then the type of change that you want to influence is then linked to what, for me, it's values. It's so I feel that if I always lean, and now politics is about choices and about decisions that you make. You're never going to make a decision that is going to keep everyone happy, and I think if you do, you're doing it wrong, actually. So you've got to take a stand at certain aspects. And for me, if I go back to what my values are, and therefore what defines the decisions that I make, and therefore the type of change that I want to influence. I think for me, that's the leadership. That's the definition of leadership that I'm comfortable with. And I think in terms of style, it always goes back to participatory decision-making, consensus decision-making. I like to hear different views. Ultimately, you'll have to take a stand and make a decision. But, you know, I've always said to people that we may not agree on things, but I will always come back and explain why I've done things a certain way. So.
Okay, and knowing that and having gone through your journey, what is one piece of advice, if you could give a younger Priyanca today, what would it be?
Gosh, probably I had always struggled growing up with self-confidence. So I'd always thought that I wasn't good enough and that I wasn't this enough or that enough, or, you know. And so I think the piece of advice that I would have given, that I'd give my younger self, is that you're good enough. And just, you know, just do it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, I'm going to move to a slightly different track of questions. And when did you first notice or encounter any ceilings or barriers for women of colour in Aotearoa, New Zealand, throughout your career? And how did you respond to those barriers?
Oh, God, right from the get-go, really. I think anyone of colour would probably identify with that. And it predated standing for Parliament, frankly. You know, often when I worked in the violence prevention space, whether it was in the refuge space or the public sector, I was often the only woman of colour speaking up for other women of colour. I was always perceived to be younger than I potentially was, and so that, you know, was not great when you're trying to be taken seriously as well. So young woman, ethnic, all of that together, I felt that I needed to work a lot harder to be taken seriously. And also when I stood for Parliament, there was just a general disinterest. So, you know, when I stood in 2017, actually even in 2014, which was the first time that I stood, I was the highest ranked non-MP candidate both years. But generally the response, you know, when you see media articles and things like that, it was, oh, she's a woman and she's Indian, she ticks a bunch of boxes, so that's what she's doing there. It was never a, let's find out if she has a story, if she wants to do something in there, you know? Okay. So there was a lot of that. When I stood in 2017 for the first time for an electorate, so in 2014 I ran list only. And of course, when you're list only, you don't get the big billboards. You do when you're running for an electorate. And I had some very well-meaning people say to me that with a name like Radhakrishnan, no one's ever going to vote for you in New Zealand, you know. So you might want to consider taking your husband's name, which is Richardson, which is pretty much as long. It's about 2 letters shorter or something. But of course, it's an Anglo-Saxon name, so everyone can say it, which... And you know, I considered it very briefly, I'm very ashamed to say, but I thought about it and I thought, I haven't taken my husband's name for a number of reasons, including feminism, but I thought about it for the election. I thought, well, if people actually can't say my name, then that might be slightly problematic. And so I talked to someone who was a bit of a mentor to me and was already in Parliament. And I said to her, look, a few people have mentioned this, you know, should I do it? And she was like, well, how would it make you feel if you changed your name? And I said, like a sellout, completely. Like I'd be doing it knowing I was a sellout. And she said, well, then don't do it. And she's now my boss, the Prime Minister. But and I'm so pleased I took her advice. But like that, there are so many little microaggressions that you face, or things that people say, even that's well-meaning, that makes you feel like you don't fit in.
No, I completely relate to that. Sometimes there really is a concrete ceiling for women of colour in New Zealand. Do you think these barriers have changed or that they've eased since then? Like, do you still feel that same sort of tokenism and microaggressions?
I don't so much now as a minister. I think people kind of have to take what I say seriously.
That's good, yeah.
I don't know, can I say that?
Yes,
definitely. So I don't know whether the landscape has changed or it's just my circumstance has changed and therefore I don't see it quite as much, you know? I think I'm optimistic that it's changed a little bit. And I think as we see, and it's not good enough, you know, Bonita said that as the first person of Indian origin to be a minister, this is after we've had migration from India to New Zealand from the 1890s. So it's taken a wee while, you know, and it's not good enough. We need to see people of colour, women of colour, younger people in various levels of decision making. I think only then things will really change in a way that is sustainable, and where others don't experience. But again, I'm also mindful that the barriers I faced were very different to the barriers that other women before me have faced, you know, in decades and generations before. The challenges change, and I'd like to think that they get a little bit less prevalent as we see more diversity in different spaces. But I do also think there's a lot more work we need to do collectively.
No, absolutely. When you were elected as minister, did you feel that pressure going into Parliament that you are the first minister of Indian origin to be for New Zealand? I mean, what was that like?
Didn't initially occur to me, frankly, when I first, till people started saying it. And then I thought, actually, yeah, it's a good point. But, you know, going into Parliament, though, yes. And I tell you, some of the simplest things which sound really silly, but, you know, as a woman, when you go to different events, probably as a man too, frankly, but you want to be appropriately dressed, right, to different things. But I think it's a bit easier as a man. You put a suit on and it's generally accepted everywhere. Whereas for me, if I loved wearing Indian clothes, so if I'm going to an Indian event, I'd like to wear a sari or, you know, something. And so initially as a new MP, you don't actually have anyone to look at what's appropriate in different, it's, you know, it's such a basic sort of dilemma and real first world problem, but you know, it's just those little simple things that you don't really have anyone to look to that looks like you and has been in that sphere, and I think that holds true for different people in different spheres and sectors, and that's why representation is important.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so a little bit, but I didn't dwell on it.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So playing on that and not having someone that looks like you in this space, how have mentors played a role in your career to date? And who is the one mentor that's had the most impact on your journey so far?
Yeah, I've been fortunate to have a few, and I place a huge amount of value on mentoring. I never used to. It's not something that I thought about when I was young myself. I never actively sought mentors. Just, you know, I think the fact that I never charted my course probably says a lot about the type of person I was. I didn't, and therefore never really looked for mentors. But since, and definitely in the political journey, it's been incredibly useful because politics and Parliament is a space that is quite unique in terms of the way things work, in terms of the strategy to get in, even, you know, to be really blunt about it. You don't just sort of sail in. You've got to have a bit of a strategy and a plan and be able to execute that. And it really helps if you have somebody working with you who understands that space well. So the person that I mentioned at university who first suggested that I stand for Parliament and said he would mentor me was Pete Hodgson, who used to be a education minister, health minister, one of Labour's strategists. And he was true to his word. He mentored me for the years before I got in, and every month would have a coffee, introduced me to the boss back then, who was also a mentor, whether she knew it or not. I also worked briefly for Phil Goff before he became the mayor. He was Labour's ethnic community spokesperson, and I was his advisor at the time. He played a mentoring role as well. So I've had sort of formal and informal mentors. It's quite different, but I think it's hugely valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So you've spent most of your life work advocating on behalf of communities whose voices are unheard. And what's a key thing that organisations, workplaces, or people need to remember when engaging with vulnerable and marginalised communities?
Yeah, not to consider them vulnerable and marginalised, I think would be the first thing.
Yeah, definitely.
And because people go through different things in life, right? So largely the people that I've worked with or advocated for have been victim survivors of violence. So again, often women who were incredibly well educated, had some really good jobs, didn't fit the stereotypes that people would place them in. And I think understanding that even when someone is at the worst point in their life and can't speak for themselves, that they have agency and that you're not doing things for them, but you are, I guess what you're trying to do is change the system so that they have a voice. And if they don't at that particular point in time and need to lean on you to be that voice, to do it in a way that's respectful of the individual. So I think that's something that I felt acutely throughout all of that work that I did. And it's easy when someone doesn't speak English as a first language, or someone is from a different socioeconomic strata as you, or you perceive them to not be as educated as you are, to dismiss them. And that is awful, because what you do is disempower that person. So I think when you're working with groups of people who might fit that description, to give them the respect that they deserve.
No, that's brilliant. I think being mindful of the spaces that you're in is so important as well. And we've had a question come through as a follow-up from the audience, and it is, what avenues would you recommend for young people trying to make a difference in these areas?
Sorry, what was the start of that again?
What avenues would you recommend for young people trying to make a difference in these areas?
So it depends on the areas, but if it is working with groups of people who would benefit from some advocacy, I'm assuming that's the question, then to find others who are already doing it. Because obviously, not always, but sometimes there are already groups that are set up that are doing some of this work who would really appreciate volunteers or appreciate the expertise and skills of groups of people. So I'd say find someone who's doing it and get on board and work through them. Mm-hmm. But if there is nothing else and you need to set something up, then talk to people who've done that, something similar in the past, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely great advice. So what are some of your aspirations and hopes for ethnically diverse young people in Aotearoa? Sorry, it's a very loaded question.
My hopes and aspirations. I really want people to be able to feel safe, to feel valued, to feel that they're heard, and have a sense of belonging. And that means different things for different people. And once you have that, then I feel that you feel confident enough to participate, whatever that participation or contribution looks like as well. And that's what I would want for all young people and those from ethnic communities as well.
Okay, and then how does someone who doesn't have the privilege or connections break those barriers and actually feel like they belong in the space that they're in?
Yeah, gosh, that's a hard one. Often I think I've come across people who don't even realize they do have the privilege. So for example, everyone in this room has a form of privilege, just the fact that you're here or online and being part of a space like this. But I think maybe it's not so much about those who feel they don't have the privilege breaking through barriers, but those who do, making space for those who might need that additional support or need the system to change to ensure that everyone has a voice. I think that's what I'd say. Yeah,
no, definitely. And then a follow-up to that question that's just come through is, with larger organizations, how do we actively incorporate cultural competency so that we're moving in the right direction?
Yeah, that's actually an area that I'm really interested to learn a bit more about, frankly. So the government's got an employment strategy, and that translates into 7 different employment action plans. One of them I lead, and that's the one for former refugees, new migrants, and ethnic communities more broadly. Part of that is looking at both the public and private sectors, and looking at what companies are doing well in this space, and speaking to the KPMG representatives in the room as well. I'm really keen to learn what companies are doing well to make their spaces more inclusive, different kinds of people being recruited, but also progressing to senior levels as well. Something I'm looking at in the public sector. The Public Service Commission's leading some work on this also. Pay transparency is another area, whether it's looking at the gender pay gap or ethnic pay gaps. And all of those then feed into inclusivity, right? So again, it's representation. If you don't see yourself at a senior level, then you don't think that you can aspire to that necessarily. If you're not being paid as well as somebody else who's doing the same job as you, just because you're brown and a woman, then that feeds into not feeling included as well, and it's not fair, basically. So I forgot what your question was. I got on my hobby horse of
it disappeared. Oops, that's all right.
What can companies do
for cultural competency?
Cultural competency
in big organisations. There we go.
Yeah. So I think it's also having. I spoke to somebody today. He will remain unnamed for now, but spoke to somebody. And I said he had been talking to people from Indian and Chinese communities around businesses and business associations. And I was like, well, so what are you going to do? You're now in a position of authority. What are you going to do for these communities here in Auckland? And then he goes, well, they just need to join business associations. And I was like, well, not quite that easy. What if they don't feel like it's a space that is inclusive of them? I was like, no, they've just got to take it over then. And so I feel that's probably not the right response. So I feel you need people with cultural competency who actually can understand what it's like for other people who are not like them, and can change some of those systemic barriers that keep people out. And so some of those things that I said, pay transparency, representation, progression, career progression, all of that feed into it. But I think really having people at leadership levels who have the levers to be able to change things, who understand what cultural competency is and has that capability is key.
All right. That now feeds into our next follow-up. What advice would you give to a woman of colour trying to make change in a corporate world who has been told to dilute it down to make the change more palatable?
Ooh.
Again,
Ouch.
another very loaded one, yeah.
To make the change more palatable to whom? I don't know that I'm the authority on this one. I've never worked in the corporate world, frankly, so I don't know if I'm an authority on that. But I would say to anyone in that situation, in any sphere, to find some allies so that they can back her up on the change that she wants to see, so that she doesn't need to make it palatable.
Absolutely. Building a network is so important.
Yeah. Allies. People don't often realize building allies. Really good thing to do.
I had another question come through. One of the things this person struggles with as a leader is caring about a lot of things and having this need to solve every issue in the world, which has led to burnout. Are there any words of wisdom you can give?
None of us are going to be able to solve every issue, frankly. Pick your battles, is what I'd say. Yeah. Pick your battles, find allies. I always believe in the power of the collective. You get stuff done when you're part of a collective in a way that's much more efficient than you just trying to battle on yourself, I think.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions. To sort of close it off, what key points would you like the audience to take away from this kōrero?
Find allies. No, kidding. What key points? I think it would go back to, I think for me, really, it's about mentorship and feeling and surrounding yourself with people who want the same change as you. It's about also what we can do in this room. Again, going back to that concept of privilege, and amplifying voices. You know, I've been in so many meetings where going back to, again, young female, woman of color, where you'd say things and like no one hears you, and then suddenly someone else says the exact same thing, and suddenly it's the best idea in the world. That feels really shitty. So really amplifying other people's voices and giving them credit when they, all of that feeds into people being seen and being heard. That's more than one takeaway, so I'll stop there.
Okay, well that is all the time we have today. So thank you so much for Priyanca for being such an inspiring speaker and for being a part of the Speaker and Networking Series for 2022. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your story with us, and it's really important for the next generation of ethnically diverse leaders to hear from and be exposed to, and for us to normalise influential leaders from diverse backgrounds. Thank you again to KPMG for sponsoring the 2022 series. And finally, a huge thank you to all of you for giving up your evening and attending the session. And all our young leaders watching from home, a massive shout out to everyone who contributed to the Slido and to the Q&A. Whether submitting a question or just upvoting someone else's question. We unfortunately couldn't cover all the questions submitted, but we really appreciate your active participation. So to formally conclude today's event, please join me with a closing karakia. Po huriri, po rarama, po o te whakaroa, po o te tangata, po o te aroha, te po e here, ne e ai tātoa, Māori ora ki e tātou, Homie, huie, tai kie. Thank you for coming, ka kite.
Kia ora. Thank you. Thank you, Shane.
Lovely speaker.
Thank you all. Great questions.